Welcome, everybody, and happy fall. I'm thrilled to welcome you to Ill Housed, a virtual roundtable discussion sponsored by the Living New Deal's New York City chapter. I'm Peggy Crane, the director of the chapter, which operates under the aegis of the Living New Deal, the California nonprofit that has been mapping New Deal sites around the country, more than 17,500 and counting, and bringing public attention to what the New Deal accomplished during an extraordinary decade in our country's history. Back then, about 85 years ago, America suffered an acute housing crisis. How did the New Deal respond to it? And what lessons can we take away from its successes and its shortcomings as we address today's housing crisis? The current crisis was set in motion by the Great Recession of 2008 and exacerbated dramatically by the pandemic, with evictions and homelessness continuing to soar. An acute housing shortage, not just in New York City, but nationwide, is yet another aspect of today's crisis. FDR, in his 1944 speech, setting forth a second Bill of Rights, affirmed housing as a basic human right. If we take that principle seriously as a starting point, what policies will be needed to secure that right? Adam Roberts, this evening's moderator, will foster a discussion that pools the expertise of a stellar group of speakers, encouraging them to interact with each other and with you, our audience, and to share policy approaches that are both practical and ethical. It's time now to introduce Adam. He's a policy and advocacy expert who currently serves as Director of Policy for the American Institute of Architects, New York, the trade association representing New York City's architects. Adam previously worked as a political aide for the New York City Council, as a fundraiser for nonprofits and political candidates, and as a documentary producer for PBS. Adam is also active in New York politics, where he recently served as district leader and state committee member, and recently ran for the New York State Legislature and almost won. He's also a dedicated member of the New York City chapter's working group. To you, Adam.
Thanks, Peggy, for that introduction. Thank you all for joining this evening, and welcome to Ill Housed Then and Now. We're also joined by Gail Radford, Professor of History Emerita at the State University of New York at Buffalo, Rob Robinson, formerly homeless community organizer and activist based in New York City, Samuel Stein, a housing policy analyst at the Community Service Society, and Mason Williams, Assistant Professor of Leadership Studies and Political Science at Williams College. And as Peggy said, tonight we'll be discussing how the New Deal sought to address the need for more affordable and better quality housing throughout the country, as well as the legacy of those policies today. It's important to understand the New Deal was an experiment in modernity. It was very much an attempt by its proponents to move America forward. And perhaps nowhere was this ethos of the New Deal so physically visible as in housing. It was housing where New Dealers had the ability to quite literally immerse Americans in the lifestyle that they thought Americans should be living. The New Deal gave architects, planners, and government officials the opportunity to push the boundaries of where and how Americans were living. And therefore, it's not surprising that some of the giants of American modern architecture designed New Deal housing and their policies. People like William Lescaze, Edmund Bacon, James Rouse, Louis Kahn, and others. It was New Deal housing policies and the practices it inspired that set Americans on the path to live in planned communities of towers in the park and suburban single-family homes. Their homes were often owned, not rented, and these homes were spacious and designed to accommodate cars. And above all else, they were functional. New Deal homes were designed to give the average American a better standard of living. And stylistically, they also embodied the New Deal's break with the past and vision for a more forward-thinking future by embracing design elements of modern architectural styles like Art Deco and the International style. However, this progressive vision came with limits, as the New Deal unfortunately accommodated the segregated housing policies of its time. Many New Deal housing projects were for whites only. African American neighborhoods were redlined to limit their ability to get mortgages, and covenants continued to prevent racial and ethnic minorities from living in many areas. Nevertheless, the New Deal funded or inspired the construction of huge amounts of new housing, mostly in marginalized communities. And I think nowhere is this more evident than in New York, where we see a huge concentration of New Deal housing in what was then heavily African-American Central Harlem and the heavily Jewish Lower East Side. And the voters in these areas rewarded FDR and the Democratic Party for this new housing and the other New Deal policies which raised their standard of living. And to this day, we see that housing in these communities are named for New Dealers. In the city, we have Baruch Houses, which is named for FDR's advisor, Bernard Baruch. We have Hillman Houses, named for labor leader Sidney Hillman. Vladeck Houses for labor leader Baruch Vladeck. Robbins Plaza for Ira Robbins, who was the housing advisor to Governor Herbert Lehman, who took over after FDR ascended to the presidency. Wald Houses for activist and Eleanor Roosevelt confidant Lillian Wald. So now that we have some context, let's look at a few examples of New Deal housing, which were either funded by the New Deal directly or inspired by it, so that you have a better sense of what we'll be talking about tonight. So if we could just go to the images. Perfect. So this first one here is not in New York City, it's in Maryland. This is in Greenbelt, Maryland. And under Rex Tugwell, who was one of FDR's primary housing advisors, the federal government went so far as to build entirely new experimental towns known as Greenbelts, where residents lived in international style and Art Deco suburban homes, something which must have been incredibly jarring back then for the average American to see. So we go to the next slide and we'll see Red Hook houses in Brooklyn, which similar stylistically, but was designed on a far larger scale because now we're talking about New York City. And many of New York City Housing Authority, NYCHA complexes were constructed with New Deal funding. And some of the most famous ones include First Houses, the first true NYCHA housing, Red Hook houses, Williamsburg houses, Harlem River houses, and many others as well. And on the next slide, we'll see that Castle Village in Upper Manhattan. And we'll see in Castle Village an example that these forward-thinking ideas on how Americans should be living were evident beyond public housing. It also extended into cooperative housing, which was built by New Deal aligned unions for their members. And we have examples of cooperative housing throughout the city, not just Castle Village, but perhaps most famously the Grand Street Cooperatives, an entire neighborhood essentially of cooperative housing built during that era. And then on the last slide, we'll see the Grand Concourse in the Bronx, which is a great example of how even privately funded housing was designed in the spirit of the New Deal. There were a number of companies, large companies like MetLife and developers who took the example that the New Deal set, that middle-class Americans could live in modern, forward-thinking homes. It wasn't just something for the rich. And so they built up, the Grand Concourse entirely in the Art Deco style, or largely in the Art Deco style, as well as places like Parkchester and Riverton houses. So those are just a few of the many examples of New Deal housing in New York. But hopefully this gives you a sense of what we'll be talking about this evening, particularly when we refer back to the housing that was built. So now we'll be moving to our panel, but please feel free to ask any questions you have using the Q&A function, and we'll get to those in around an hour or so. So we'll first start with Gail. Gail, if you can you tell us a bit about New Deal housing policies that were enacted nationally, but also about a lot of those policies which never came to fruition?
Yes, thank you. Let me just start by saying that those of us who worry about the issue of affordable housing, we often look back nostalgically to the New Deal. I think the remarks that we just heard, are part of that affection for this period on the part of those of us who are involved with housing. These programs produced a large amount of housing for low-income families through a number of different New Deal agencies. and instituted the first permanent program of federally subsidized housing. What's often forgotten, though, is that a major goal of the New Deal housing legislation was to rescue the for-profit real estate industry and the financial institutions that supported it. Programs like the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the Federal Housing Administration, and Fannie Mae, they were successful at stabilizing the private real estate market. And this was no small achievement. When Roosevelt took office in the spring of 1933, housing starts had dropped to less than 10% of what they had been at their height in the 1920s. Meanwhile, half of all home mortgages were technically in default. Foreclosures were running at an average of 1,000 a day. So it's not surprising that one of the first actions of the new administration was to urge Congress to set up an agency that could help homeowners hold on to their homes. Homeowners Loan Corporation refinanced over 1 million mortgages. It was a highly successful program in terms of achieving its policy goals, and it was also highly successful politically. Historian Arthur Schlesinger credits it with consolidating or being a key element in consolidating middle-class support for the New Deal. But the downside of the focus on restoring the commercial market was that it didn't result in more dwellings for low-income households. Or thinking of what we've just heard, it didn't result. I would modify my initial remarks to say that it didn't result in really building out at the bottom. In fact, when production was booming in the Roaring 20s, 3/4 of the privately developed housing was aimed at the top third of the market. And that is the saturation of that market is the reason that the housing industry started going down several years before the stock market crash. The basic problem was that housing built to 20th century standards, and what I mean is flush toilets, hot water, electricity. It's an inherently expensive product, and people with low incomes couldn't afford it then and can't afford it now without some kind of intervention into the free market. Now, this situation was recognized by many people at the time. New York Senator Robert Wagner led the fight in Congress to institute the first permanent federal program of directly subsidized housing. This was the United States Housing Act of 1937. The idea was for a federal agency to provide capital to local agencies to build and manage publicly owned apartment buildings that would charge low rents. The housing authorities that were set up around the country in cities that wanted to participate in the program. The program got off to a strong start. It produced over 130 units in apartment buildings in its first 3 years of operation. But after the Second World War, American-style public housing lost favor. Now, there were many reasons for this, but it didn't help that it was put into effect at the local level by local business people, many of whom were real estate investors themselves. And they feared that good quality, inexpensive rental options posed a threat to their own economic well-being. Plus, many of these people were actively hostile to racial integration. Now, over the years, Congress tried to buttress the program with a patchwork of policies. Direct building really stopped in the 70s with Nixon putting a moratorium on housing programs. And then starting in the 1980s, the area that took the biggest hits with the Reagan tax cuts were housing. Reagan cut 90% of the support for public housing. And after that, it just really limped along. Now, moving into the present, before the pandemic, Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies calculated that approximately a quarter of the households in the US are rent burdened, by which they meant renters were paying more than 30% of their income on rent. Of these, half were paying over 50%. Now, these are the poorest households in the country. And when shelter consumes so much of their income, they have to cut back on very basic necessities, even food. So obviously, the two-track housing program of the New Deal, with powerful but indirect and invisible support for for-profit development, and low quality, stigmatizing, and underfunded options for the poor, has failed those at the bottom of the income scale. And these days, even moderate income households are faring poorly within this framework. What could we do differently? Well, here's where it's helpful to look at competing ideas for federal policy that were advanced in the interwar years, not just for the sake of historical accuracy, but because they offer us ideas for the here and now. Leading up to the New Deal, many housing experts, urban planners, architects, social workers, labor unions, advocated that the federal government adopt a policy package called modern community housing, or modern housing for short. Proponents were influenced by large-scale social housing building programs that had taken place in Great Britain and the continent in the early part of the 20th century. And these ideas were taken seriously in the United States and even influenced an experimental low-rent program that was put in place by the Public Works Administration right at the beginning of the New Deal. The modern housing proposal has a lot of interesting dimensions, but the one I think that has particular relevance today is the idea that the government needs to back a single, broadly targeted program that would create a large pool of housing that would stay outside the market, and because of this, would stay affordable for the long term. At the design level, the new construction would need to be compact. We're talking about apartment buildings, row houses. And this would have to happen in order to cut costs, but also to save on energy consumption. This was something that concerned the modern housing proponents, and it's even more important to us today, given global warming. A key feature of this whole vision is that individual units would be built to a standard that would appeal to a large proportion of the population. Now, obviously, there would be compromises compared to single-family freestanding house design, but with good planning, there would be real advantages over conventional development patterns. Walkable neighborhoods, easy access to social services, parks, recreational facilities, easy access to mass transit. So for me, this is the key insight of the modern housers. A universal program like Social Security with a wide constituency to protect it politically that offers the majority of people not just something cheaper, but something better than what they could obtain on their own in the commercial market. So at this point, maybe I'd like to just show 4 slides. Could we have that first one of mine?
Oh, yes, give me 1 second. Sorry.
That's all right. You're doing better than I could. I know.
It is. Here we go.
So I mentioned that there were big building programs in Europe that influenced modern housing advocates. And one city that was extremely successful and is very famous for the housing that it built in the 1920s is Vienna, and I'm hoping that we're going to hear more about that later in our program tonight. But just a little bit of background about the 1920s. Vienna, Austria was experiencing extreme shortages right in the years after World War I, in the period after World War I. It had a left-wing city administration that pursued an ambitious housing program. It built 60,000 units in large apartment complexes. And these complexes were built around inner courtyards. Here we see on the right one of these courtyards with a wading pool. 2 of the most famous of the complexes were named in tribute to ideals of the city leaders at the time: the Karl Marx Hof for socialism and the George Washington Hof for democracy. Okay, next slide, please. Frankfurt, Germany is another city that mounted a very ambitious and successful program. They, like Vienna, they produced new dwellings for 10% of city families. The best known part of their building program was a garden city suburb called Romerstadt in the hills above the city. It contained 1,200 homes, mostly row houses, which you see here on the right. And it's partially famous for these very compact and efficient kitchens called the Frankfurt kitchens that were part of the units. Okay, so next slide, please. Getting back closer to home, the Carl Mackley houses were built in the northeast section of Philadelphia. They were sponsored by a socially conscious labor union, and they got financing from this experimental program that I mentioned before under the Public Works Administration, the PWA. It was designed by a couple of European immigrant architects. And in terms of social amenities, you see the swimming pool, and then in back of it, in the right-hand bottom corner, and there's a building in back of it which provided changing rooms and towels and things like that. But then you entered from another doorway, and it was a place where community meetings happened and the residents put on plays. It was 3 stories high. You know, what planners today call high density, low rise. Amenities included, besides the swimming pool for adults and older children, wading pools, and a progressive nursery school. Okay, last slide, please. Here are the Harlem River houses that were mentioned earlier in our program. They're New York City, 151st and 153rd, and McCombs Place and Harlem River Drive are the edges of the 9 acres, contained 576 apartments. Thousands of people applied to get in when they were first opened. The on-site amenities, including a library, a clinic, an outdoor amphitheater, and a daycare program. One administrator of the New York City Public Authority, Housing Authority, described them to me when I was doing research for my book. He called the Harlem River houses the jewel of New York City public housing. So that's it for my remarks, and I'll pass the microphone back.
Thanks, Gail. That was great. And I think you touched on pretty much every question I have for the panel coming up. So that was incredibly thorough. I see we have someone who's raised their hand. I'll remind you all that if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function to ask them, and we'll be getting to them in a half hour or so. So next, Mason, following up on Gail's comments, I want to specifically ask you about New York State and New York City, and how many of these New Deal housing policies may have differed here from other parts of the country.
First off, thanks to the organizers, to Peggy for the invitation to be part of this panel. This is it's really an honor to share this panel with my fellow speakers. And Erica, thanks for your help too. New York's perhaps 2 most significant affordable housing programs today are direct legacies of the New Deal. They contribute an immense amount to what the city's able to do for affordable housing now. However, we've also allowed their legacy to erode in such a way as to contribute in a major way to the contemporary housing crisis. So let me just sort of sketch a quick history of the 2 programs I have in mind, one of which is public housing, built and operated by the New York City Housing Authority. And the second is rent regulation, which we don't typically think of as a New Deal housing program, but comes right out of New Deal kind of consumer politics in the World War II era. So the New York City Housing Authority was created in early 1934 in response to the Public Works Administration housing program, which itself was written into the National Industrial Recovery Act by Senator Wagner, coming out of this sort of milieu of social housing thinking that has a home in New York, but is deeply enriched by these transatlantic connections that Professor Radford was talking about. NYCHA would not have been able to get off the ground without the PWA in a number of ways. The federal New Deal pioneers public housing in America, in the city. This is initially, as Professor Radford was saying, housing of sort of astonishingly high quality. The Harlem River houses, when it opens, the architectural critic and social critic Louis Mumford describes it as, quote, an example of what New York City might be if it wants to rival the richer suburbs as a place to live and bring up children. Studded with all these social sort of forms of social provision. This ends up being, for a variety of reasons, a kind of short-lived moment where this, the city and the federal government through the PWA housing program are aiming at a very high standard of production of public housing. One of the, and you know, after the 37 law, it goes more in the direction of your sort of Tower in the Park production for low income tenants. One of the things that's distinctive about New York's experience of the New Deal in general is the degree to which it incorporated at the state and local level ambitions which were retrenched by the federal New Deal. You can tell this story in all sorts of places, but one area in which it happens is that after the 1938 New York State Constitutional Convention, the state government and the city government step in to fill this void that's been created by the end of the PWA housing programs and the shift to US housing administration programs. So New York continues producing public housing for the working class much longer than most places in America. New York's public housing is also incredibly successful for long-term for a variety of reasons that I would point people to Nicholas Dagan Bloom's great book, Public Housing That Worked, for a history of public housing in the city. But it continues to be a vital resource. There are currently something like 500,000 people on the wait list to get into New York City public housing. You know, there's this sort of trite narrative that public housing failed in America. There are 500,000 people trying to get into public housing in New York City. Should give you a sense of what a vital resource this remains, right? And if you stop and think about it, it's almost miraculous in some ways that NYCHA housing exists, right? Some of the most valuable real estate on earth is set aside for low-income residents of New York. However, it's been disinvested. You know, beginning in earnest in the 1980s, New York State steps away from some of its obligations during the Pataki years. And currently there are just, there's a terrible situation of disrepair, right? So we have this priceless resource, which is almost kind of unimaginable, right? If we were to start today, that we would end up with a program like this. And yet it's at risk of deterioration and alternatively of privatization. The ball on which has already started rolling. Just gives you a sense of what a predicament this is for local officials under the administration of a mayor who professes great admiration for New York City. You know, de Blasio came up with this plan as a way of trying to inject some capital, much needed maintenance capital. But it raises this question: what is the future of public housing in New York? Is it destined for public privatization like so much of the New Deal's legacy? So that's one. Rent regulation is fascinating because it it really sort of illustrates the sort of the ways in which the New Deal experience kind of reshaped political culture in the city. So rent control first comes to New York in its current form in 1943 through the Office of Price Administration, which itself is a really important, fascinating agency. But it's nationally supposed to be a kind of somewhat technocratic measure to restrain wartime inflation. It's not really intended to signify the government's sort of intervention in market relationships between landlords and tenants. It's an explicitly temporary emergency measure with this macroeconomic justification. However, tenant organizations and some left politicians in the city don't understand it in those terms. They see this as an opportunity to bring the protective hand of the state to bear in this relationship as a way of assuring the right to decent housing at non-exploitative rents. And so this is fascinating. New York was not a war boom city for a variety of reasons. And so their rents had not risen nearly as much in New York City in 1941, 42, 43 as they did in practically every other city that had sort of larger war factory economies. It comes to New York because tenant organizations and the mayor, Viral LaGuardia, pushed Roosevelt and the New Dealers, saying, we need this. And so it gets created through that kind of political mechanism rather than a sort of bloodless technocratic approach in 1943. And it's because it's got this politics to it, right? This is a social right that the government is recognizing in housing, that after the federal government gets out of the business of rent regulation after World War II, New York State takes this up, continues rent control in New York City. In 1969, there's a supplemental or alternative program called rent stabilization, which stabilizes units that were built after World War II. At that point in the early 70s, there are about 1.2, somewhere in there, million apartments in New York that are regulated, providing a kind of security and protection for tenants that would be unimaginable in a free marketplace, or an unregulated marketplace, I should say. These programs also have eroded over the years. There have been a number of ways in which that's happened. Some of the main ones are in the early to mid 1990s. There's a spate of deregulation, what's called luxury decontrol. When, in 1997, the state legislature passes a law saying once a unit rents for above $2,000, it can be deregulated upon vacancy. There are other measures at the same time. Major capital improvements allow you to sort of boost the price of the rent. There's a 20% vacancy bonus written into the 97 law, which leads to a spate of tenant harassment by unscrupulous landlords who are trying to chase tenants out to vacate these apartments so they can jack the rent, collect the 20% vacancy bonus, reach the decontrol threshold. And there's effectively a kind of cottage industry of tenant harassment all through the first part of the 21st century. You can, everybody in New York, it seems like, knows somebody who has a story about the heat being cut off, about necessary maintenance being deferred, about unnecessary maintenance being done to get the MCI allowance. And as a consequence, a lot of units have fallen out of the rent regulation system. However, I'm also impressed, much as I think it's a miracle that NYCHA is still around at the scale it is, that tenant movements have been able to fight off full-on deregulation. Through this entire 50 years where real estate's supposed to be running New York City, right? During the fiscal crisis era, people think that rent regulation is the next thing on the chopping block after free tuition at CUNY. In the 1990s, it seems like there's going to be this vast conservative mobilization that's going to get rid of it at the state level. And tenants managed to hold on to the point where in 2019, when Democrats take control of the state legislature, the state Senate for the first time, really, for a sustained period, many years, the system is still around. The regulatory system is still around and able to be strengthened through the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which lifts the vacancy decontrol threshold, gets rid of the vacancy bonuses, constrains MCI. And so there was still a legacy from the New Deal able to be built on by this new generation of progressive, oftentimes younger leaders, who many of whom came out of tenant movement backgrounds. Some of whom had pursued elective office because of tenant issues. And so the situation changed pretty quickly after 2019. In a sense, this is the tragedy of the pandemic arriving when it did, was we were at this threshold of kind of recovering a really ambitious sort of progressive housing politics in the city, just as this catastrophic emergency came. But the studies that were done of evictions in the aftermath of the 2019 law show that this really did make a difference. And so again, I do think that while the erosion of the New Deal's legacy has been a major contributing factor in the contemporary housing crisis in New York, the legacy is still there for a new generation of progressives to build on.
Thanks, Mason. I mean, that's all rings so true. And I think especially, in the context of all this, we often get caught up in discussing the New Deal and housing with what was physically built, but so much of it is also the policies that preserved what was already there. So, now moving on to the international context, Sam, I was wondering if you could talk about how during the New Deal era, other countries, I think we've already talked about a bit, most famously Austria with Red Vienna, pursued similar policies to those in the US. Could you tell us a bit about some of those international examples, but also about their influence today?
Thanks, Adam. The answer to that is sort of. I'll do my best. I grew up in a household that was very aware of the New Deal legacy. I didn't send around the photo, but the steps right in front of my house growing up have a metal stamp in them that says "Built by the Works Progress Administration, 1935 to 1939." So there was no getting around it. It was there. And today I live on Francis Perkins Place, which is a street in New York that's named after the New Deal labor secretary. And kind of connecting what Gail and Mason said before, I'm active in the New York housing movement today, and a lot of what we're fighting for and fighting against comes out of this period. We're fighting to preserve and expand the best parts of the New Deal legacy, and we're also fighting to overcome the worst parts of housing policy of the time and the attack on it that came in years later. Gail talked a bit about how some of the interwar housing movement, the modern housing movement, was inspired by attempts at large-scale community planning in many places, but including Vienna and the Red Vienna period. And I learned about that history from Gail's excellent book, Modern Housing for America. And I know a lot of other New York housing activists my age also read this book in recent years and came to sort of see the city around us a little bit differently, and also wanted to have some of the experience that that modern housing movement had of seeing how other cities with left-wing governments figured out ways to do housing that really worked. So Red Vienna is a tremendous model with it's 60,000 units of public housing that, as we saw in those pictures, is really beautifully built, really well maintained over the years, really thoughtfully planned in terms of communal facilities mixed with relatively generous housing accommodations. And a lot of us wanted to see it for ourselves. And so a delegation of nearly 50 New Yorkers just got back from Vienna. The group included members of New York City housing organizations, so tenants and people experiencing homelessness, organizers from those organizations, including a lot of people who live in or grew up in public housing, elected officials from the left who are interested in this model, alternatives to the way it works in New York, researchers and academics, mostly from New York, but some from other parts of the country, and union delegates from 1199, the Healthcare Workers Union, all came together to see the legacy of Red Vienna, and also to see the more contemporary social housing programs in Vienna. So at this point, both because of the Red Vienna legacy and because they continued building social housing after World War II, more than half of the population of Vienna lives in social housing. The housing is open to 4/5 of the population. So to the extent that it's means tested, it's for the bottom 80% of people. So basically everybody we met was eligible. You have to have the same address for 2 years and then you can get in. So that can be a challenge for very recent migrants, for students, for people getting out of prison. But they have a temporary housing system that you can use to get into social housing. And they also have widespread rent control and a very low eviction rate and collective bargaining agreements that cover 97% of workers and other things that make it possible for this system to succeed. They've continuously reinvested in the original 60,000 public housing developments, which, by the way, are very much open. You can walk right into the courtyards and see it. It's not like Nitro, where all the green space is fenced off, keep the public and residents out. And then they built more. So some of what they built more after World War II is public housing in the model that they were building before. And some of it is subsidized housing built by limited dividend housing corporations that are sort of like our Mitchell-Lama housing and other forms of not-for-profit housing in New York and in the US, except that they never go private. And there are pretty strict regulations about reinvesting the rents back into the buildings and into building more subsidized housing. So whereas we spend a lot of money basically preserving affordable housing that's at risk of going private, they renew the investments in the buildings to keep them going. And the rents go down after the initial mortgages are paid off. This is like unheard of in the US. When the mortgages get paid off in an affordable housing complex in the US, it often has the opportunity to go private. And if it's in an area that's been gentrified, that's very often what happens. So this is what we saw in Vienna, this kind of communal luxury, where some of the housing looks quite a bit like very fancy housing that we're used to seeing in New York, and some of the urban design does as well. And I had to have the sort of cognitive dissonance of seeing a place that looks like kind of yuppie schlock, but know that it's actually for poor people, working class people, and middle class people, and that it's actually really nice. It's nice to have nice things. We're just associated with nice things, meaning that it becomes more expensive, evictions happen, communities are displaced, and we have this cycle over and over again. So I think coming back from that delegation, the 48 of us are very committed to doing as much as we can to institute this model, but we also know that you can't just have this model of social housing absent from secure healthcare, because a lot of people go into medical debt and become homeless for that reason. You can't have it without having strong pensions and Social Security, because a lot of people feel like they need home ownership in order to have money to retire on later on. So it's a bigger struggle than just the housing struggle. But we're going to do what we can. And some of that is fighting for new models of new public and subsidized housing that looks much more like this model than some of what we've done in the past. And some of it is about expanding rent control and rent stabilization in New York, eviction protections, building code enforcements, all the things that are necessary to make sure that the private housing stock is not allowed to be this cash cow for the real estate industry where they can just pull money out of it and not provide decent housing in the meantime. We have to be going after the worst practices in the private sector, even as we're expanding the public sector, or else we'll fall into this trap of extremely divided housing once again. So that's a lot on our plate. It's a lot to do, but we're inspired to do the work by what we saw in Vienna. Also, I should say, I have no love for Austria or the Austrian government, as should be obvious to anybody who knows the history of the 20th century. You know, some of the best things in the world happened in Austria in the 20th century, and some of the worst things in the world happened. So I could write off the whole model based on that and just say, I hate Austria, fine. But what we're looking to do is implement a very successful housing and broader social democratic project from a city in a country that has a really rough history, in this city, which is in a country that has a really rough history. And it's a city that itself has a pretty rough history when you look back at how we've treated people here and internationally. So I guess that's the final lesson that I take, is that you don't have to buy the whole thing hook, line, and sinker to see it doesn't have to be the way that we've gotten used to it being in New York and in America more broadly.
Thanks, Sam. And that's such an important note to end on, particularly as we consider, New Deal policies today. And I think I'll assume most of us are on the left, this disenchantment with maybe where things are headed nationally, and understanding that, there's a country like Austria, which is so much more far right than hopefully we can ever imagine here. And yet look at Red Vienna and how that's endured. So last, Rob, we'll come to you before we get to panelists questions for all the panelists. So Rob, in the context that the New Deal ended 80 years ago, and we've established here how much we owe to the New Deal, how aware do you think most Americans and most New Yorkers are of its legacy for housing? And especially as a housing activist, how aware do you think most of your fellow housing activists are of the New Deal's legacy today?
So thank you. And thank you to all the organizers for inviting me. But I want to just follow up Sam's comment. When I found out Sam was going to Vienna, I asked a question that he just alluded to. This is why I always appreciated working with Sam. He's a critical thinker. And sometimes with that history and the legacy of that city that he went and visited, he still went anyway, because he wanted to gain something. And I have a lot of respect for that. Sam and I had an email conversation before he was on his way about that. And I was like stunned. And I reached out to friends and, where Sam is going? And, folks were like, yeah. So I just have to admire that. I really appreciate that legacy. With that being said, these are three people that are going to be hard to follow, but I'm going to start out by saying I'm going to explain my view from the ground up, being formerly homeless, and how I look at it and try to connect to that legacy, and how the people that I work with, I think, look at that legacy. So I think Professor Radford started off with fantasizing about it. And I think often there is a lot of fantasizing about it. It was a needed thing at that time, right? And I do think conditions change over a period of time. And we need to understand that, right? What was able to happen at a certain time may not necessarily be able to happen now. And we have to think outside of the box, as I said earlier, in our offline conversation. And I'll pick on you a little bit, Mason, that you didn't mention Mitchell Lama, because I do think that was a huge program in New York with respect to housing, but we didn't have a vision to look past 30 years. And we gave folks an out of that program, an easy out, and they ran. But one thing that none of us seem to, well, I don't want to say none of us, and I know that's bad because I don't like to paint people with broad brushes, but I think this is a struggle about land. And I'm surprised that the conversation didn't sort of come up from land, right? We have a struggle here because of our fundamental relationship and the commodification of land, which is a problem, right? So that makes it difficult to institute a lot of things that were able to happen 85 years ago that may not be able to happen now, right? So you take Manhattan, for example, big community land trust, wave in the city, alternative structures. But realistically, when air rights are for sale, who is going to give you a piece of land in perpetuity in Manhattan? It just probably ain't going to happen. But I can't say that vocally. We have to do some type of education process for people to understand the conditions that we're in. So, and I think some activists are starting to engage in a popular and political education and learn from international struggles around this issue, because that's where my thinking came from, the relationship to land, learning from Abashali and the shack dwellers movement in South Africa, and learning from the landless workers movement in Brazil. Brazil's constitution says land has to serve a social function, social purpose, growing food, housing people. It speaks to those other conditions that Sam was referring to, healthcare, wellness. So a lot of those things are tied to it, right? Access to water, access to, community, all of these things create a good housing environment, and we don't often talk about it. Back in that New Deal, we talked about housing as a human right, but we as a country, we don't embrace a human rights mandate. We shroud that and say we're a democracy, we don't need to follow international human rights law. That's problematic, right? So if your country created or had a hand in creating this institution, and Eleanor Roosevelt helped create the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, why don't we abide by this document, right? Article number 25 says we have the human right to a home. I was never taught that in school. I didn't learn it until I became an activist and started asking information and learning more and more. So I think we're going through a change now with young folks who are educating themselves. They're sort of getting educations in schools, but understanding that the curriculums that are being fed to them aren't necessarily fitting the conditions that they're experiencing out in communities. So many of them are saying, how do I take my degree and make social change, right? And I see that in law schools. When I'm going down to the University of Miami next week to speak to a conference at the law school there on the right to food and right to housing. So folks are thinking outside of the box. I was at Duke recently having the same types of conversations, and those students keep engaging me saying, okay, they taught me in school that we're a democracy, right? That I can't bring an argument about human rights into a courtroom. And I say, well, why don't you think differently? Why don't you be one of the first to challenge, right? Don't be afraid of the black robes. Go into that courtroom and say, you know what? Judge so-and-so, we have a stenographer in here typing everything. So I'm going to say my client has a human right to a home. And I dare the judge to say you don't have, let him be the first one or her to be the first one to go on record and say you don't have that right. I doubt they're going to do it. What they're going to say is go in the back and see if you can work out some type of deal, right? So we have to think outside of the box, and we have to think more creatively. I think fundamentally what we're going through in this country, we had a big fight for 15. 15 ain't getting you close to getting decent housing in New York City, right? And I said that even when folks were fighting for 15, right? I couldn't engage in that battle because what you really need is 22. Right, so you're fighting for 15, you're sort of you're bargaining with folks. So we have to think beyond. It's a struggle. It's not easy. These changes aren't going to come overnight. Fundamentally, rents rise faster than wages. I'll criticize unions a little bit. Yeah, there was a time, and I lived, Sam, at one time in 1199 housing at 1199 First Avenue. It was built by the union for their members. What happened to those unions that were building housing like that? 1199 is still one of the progressive unions around. I think if they have the ability, they'll try. 32BJ in New York is a good progressive union. But the tenor has changed. There's a shift from that. And you find the unions, especially the trade unions, saying, okay, we're going to put luxury towers up. That means jobs for our group. We're all in favor of that. So it's kind of hard to work with you, community, and your fight, because we want these good paying jobs. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done around these issues. It's a lot of challenges, and it comes from a lot of different directions. And I think that's what we need to understand, right? We tend to operate in silos in this country when we organize. When you go outside of the US, movements work together to try to build better conditions for the country. And I think that's a problem that we have in this country. I work with International Alliance of Inhabitants, 12,000 members worldwide that stand on the zero eviction platform. I am USA Canada coordinator of International Alliance of Inhabitants. We brought them together with some of the folks that were doing tenant organizing in New York. And we had a people's tribunal on evictions while the whole right to counsel thing was bubbling up. And I think a lot of energy came from those connections and learning from struggles outside of the US. There needs to be more of that sharing. The forces we are facing are global in nature, and we need to organize global in nature, organize resistance global in nature. But again, for me as an organizer, a lot of it came from a historical context, having access to people like Peter Marcuse, Tom and Gotti. These are urban planners, progressive urban planners that I've worked with. Miguel Robles Duran at the New School I'm currently working with. These are folks who have given me the history lesson, but I find there are other people I can give further lessons. So I just said to Sam via text, I ordered Gail's book. I ordered it, right? Because I want to know it. I hadn't read it. I need to understand that history, but I also think that as organizers, we need to do a better job of popular and political education. And we have to, our not-for-profit model of organizing, I think, needs to shift. When I work in other countries, it's done out of need, not a profession. And I think there's a big difference when you work out of need versus this is my job. I learned that lesson years ago when we were doing the work of Take Back the Land. And we worked with a group in Minnesota who we asked the simple questions, take back the land. The group was more Missourians organized for whatever the name was. And we asked the lead organizer, do you believe in housing as a human right? The response was, I believe in housing as a human right, but I'm paid to organize for principal reduction on mortgages. This was post mortgage crisis. And that's when I said, okay, there's a huge separation in this country, right? There are people that believe in housing as a human right and are willing to fight for it. There are other people that fight for their salary. I get it. We all need a decent standard of living. But I think when it comes to organizing, I'm always in favor of separating yourself from a paycheck to do the work versus doing it from your heart. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Rob. That was great. And this whole panel could have gone a completely different direction. As you said, we could have talked about Henry George and his influence on the New Deal. That would have been, we should do another panel like that.
So much can come out of these types of discussions, and you realize it. And as everybody was talking, I kept saying land, because as Tom and Gotti and I often will say to each other, it's the land, stupid. I came out of shelter banging my hand on tables. We need affordable housing. We need affordable housing. But then I came to a realization, you can't do that until you control the land, right? It's never going to be affordable because land is a commodity. So we have to change that fundamental relationship to land.
Absolutely right. Okay, so we're going to move to a few questions now for the panelists. And if each of you could just respond, and I think for the sake of time, just like 1 minute, maybe minute and a half, 2 max, that would be great. So this way we can also get to some audience Q&A. So to start off with, the New Deal saw the American left largely unite behind the concept of building more publicly and privately funded housing. This is something that's really come up, I think, in everything all four of you have discussed. Yet today, many of the most vocal opponents of new housing, what they call NIMBYs, not in my backyard, they come from the political left. And what do you think altered this consensus on the left about building more housing and caused there to be, this division we see today, where some on the left are pro-housing, but many on the left are unfortunately against both public and private housing? So I guess we'll go with Sam first, and then I'll call on each one of you to respond.
Sure. I mean, part of the problem with the public housing system that we created in the first place was that it wasn't actually very good at building more housing. And it wasn't supposed to. It was a one-to-one replacement for the housing that it demolished. So we never really had a system where we were adding to the housing stock from the bottom up. We had a system that would replace poor housing conditions with public housing, often not with the same people. Meanwhile, we were building out the suburbs. So I don't think that there's like a model that we can look back to and say like, yeah, that's what we want. It's part of the reason why like 50 of us just went to Vienna rather than, going to Co-op City, which we should also be doing. But so that's the first thing I'll say. The second thing I'll say is that I'm not sure I really accept the premise that the left are NIMBYs and the right are not. It's pretty jumbled up. And there's also a pretty big diversity of voices that call themselves anything in my backyard. Yes, no, social housing, public housing, whatever. So I think what we need to be fighting for is control over the land and the development of housing for the people. That might bring together a different coalition than the kind of mostly privatized land use politics we have right now.
Thanks. Rob, if you'd like to add your thoughts.
I think a lot of it comes out of this narrative that I'm totally against now, that home ownership leads to wealth. I make the argument that it leads to perpetual debt. So it's created individualism, right? I got mine, Sam's family should work hard and get theirs, right? I achieved the American dream because I came here and worked hard. That family didn't work hard. So I do think we're sort of guilty of a large part of our own problem. I think the individualism that exists in this country is a huge part of that problem that Sam just laid out. So that's I often have these debates with a lot of the professors that I work with, and people look at me in shock, but I'm a firm believer in that.
Agreed. Gail?
Well, I think Sam covered a lot of the ideas that came to my mind when you posed the question. But I just add, as someone who grew up in California, I've been fascinated by the YIMBY movement in California and the kind of I don't know, virtuous self-presentation of the people who are pushing the idea that people should be able to build little rental apartments in their backyard. And to me, it just seems kind of silly to imagine that that's really going to help low-income houses to be able to move to some kind of backyard shack in Napa Valley. I mean, it's not going to create the numbers of units that we really need, which are enormous. And so I've just been wondering if this the press seems to love these stories and kind of present them as a big victory when the zoning rules are changed in these very expensive places. But I don't think in the great scheme of things it's going to make much difference. I don't know. So that's all I can add to that.
Great. And Mason?
Yeah, just two quick thoughts. Whenever sort of thinking about housing policy discourse, like there's always the question of how something gets framed and what that obscures. So just 2 quick points. Suburbs should not get off the hook for exclusionary zoning and land use restrictions in this conversation, right? So we tend to focus on, whoever's blocking development in wealthy neighborhoods in the city, but like there's a much broader metropolitan context that needs to be considered there. The second is just, we talked at the top about some of the problems New Deal housing policies contributed to. And I just want to flag the fact that racial segregation and class segregation make this problem much more difficult because you end up in these situations where communities have to look hard at, sort of pushing back against new construction precisely because it could serve as an engine of gentrification. Right? So we, as it does with everything in New York, right? As Earl Lewis, the great journalist, once put it, segregation is a poison. It poisons everything it comes into contact with in New York. And this question of construction is, in some instances, just another example of that.
Great, and you actually touched on the next 2 questions, I think, before we go to the audience Q&A, and we could just go in the same order. So Sam, we'll be starting with you, talking specifically about suburbs and towers in the park, which at their time, were viewed as being green and sustainable because of their access to green space. I mean, today, because of their reliance on cars and their sprawling nature, lack of density, they're often looked at as being, the antithesis of sustainable design, of green, of what it means to have a green city. So how do we reconcile the impacts of these new, not very green New Deal housing policies and buildings that were produced because of those policies with these calls that we've heard for the last few years for a Green New Deal?
Well, I don't think that all is lost necessarily with the original developments. I think a lot of them can be renovated in pretty systematic ways. NYCHA is even doing some of this right now with heating and cooling systems, even as things are not as good as they should be in NYCHA. There has been a large scale effort at switching out the heating and cooling systems. With the Green New Deal, mostly it's about money. If we put the money into these retrofits, we can get them done. There are some where the location is, in a place that was perfectly safe a while ago and now is in jeopardy because of rising sea levels. That's somewhat of a different story. But even if these were not the most green buildings when they were built, though sometimes they were for their time, it's generally considered to be more environmentally sustainable to retrofit them than to tear them down and build something new altogether. Like, we should be building new green buildings in addition to retrofitting what we built out before.
Great, Rob?
I think Sam laid it out pretty clear, but I would just add that work creates jobs, and there is a section in the federal government called Section 3. Give those jobs to public housing people, residents, right? I think that's a way to lower the homeless population, to start to work on those buildings that, right now has a 17% vacancy rate because those apartments are falling into a state of disrepair. And the 500,000 people that Mason mentioned earlier, there's 500,000 people living in it. So the city really can't get rid of it, because where do you put this other city of 500,000? So that's one of the reasons why it's still standing, right? That's a huge part of the reason. But I do think that we need to focus on that, right? Section 3, right? You want to help the economy. These are going to create sustainable wage jobs that I think people living in those developments would be appreciative of. But there are federal guidelines that say that this should happen, but they've basically been swept under the rug.
Great, Gail?
Well, I'd just like to underline what Rob said about jobs as we try to make the case to the public about moving toward greener buildings. I mean, I think this has real possibilities, both, in reality, but also politically. So I'll just pass on to Mason.
I'm happy to yield back my time if that'll help us get an extra audience question and what everybody, I agree with what everybody else has said.
Perfect. So we'll turn now to the audience as we just have like 10, 15 minutes left. So just looking here, we'll start with Phil's question, which I think is a really good one, that most of what we've talked about are big city projects, but there were many examples of New Deal housing policies that seeped into small towns. I mean, the Greenbelts are a great example of an attempt to literally create a new version of small town America that sort of in its own way succeeded. And we're living with the consequences today in suburbs. But how far down the concentrated population scale did these New Deal housing policies extend? Did they go to large towns? And we'll start, I guess, with Mason, since you yielded your time.
I'll have to plead ignorance here. I'm a historian of New York City, and I just frankly haven't done the research to be able to actually answer this question in any real way. So I apologize for the limits of my knowledge here.
No problem. Gail, I think you've worked on this a bit. Would you like to answer?
Well, I think, in terms of the narrative that we've all heard, but those of us who are aware of New York City, we rejected that public housing was a total failure. In fact, I think in a lot of small communities that have built housing that doesn't, it's not towers in the park. There's a lot more success than people are aware of. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks. Sam or Rob, do either of you have thoughts on New Deal and not
Just
big
a
city
quick
America?
just a quick. So I grew up in suburban Nassau County in a seaside community called Freeport. And there was 3 or 4 senior housing units, buildings built with subsidies, but they also had their own electric company, own electric and own water. So they were able to generate electricity and sell it back to New York State to gain resources to be able to do this housing. So a lot of seniors in Freeport live in this, subsidized housing at rates that are affordable. A lot of it is mutual housing. I think 2 buildings are mutual housing, the other 2 are cooperative housing, and they still exist today, well-maintained, structured. So, there are opportunities, but I think what happened in big cities, and when you think about places like Maryland and Pennsylvania and other places, I think it had to do a lot with the steel industry and manufacturing that we lost, right? There was a relationship that existed, and once we started exploiting labor overseas, there went that, right? So.
Yeah, and I'll just say that the example I gave at the beginning of my remarks is from Pawtucket, Rhode Island, which was a more major city at the time of the New Deal than it is now, since all the industry has fled, but not anything to the scale of New York City. And so, yeah, we did have public works projects in Pawtucket that go back to the New Deal and are marked that way. And the example from Greenbelt, Maryland, that was one of several places that all have green in the name that were built in the same style. I've often thought that somebody should do a study of where those places are right now in terms of maintaining or tearing down or what the legacy of what was established in the New Deal.
I volunteer you, Sam.
I'll get right to it. Thanks.
Sounds like a great dissertation, and perhaps book one day for or I don't know, architecture, poli-sci student, who knows? But it would be a good idea. Turning to Michelle's question, and this is, I think, something that is not talked about enough, is that back, Michelle's talking about in the 1960s, but during the New Deal as well, apartments were built to be much larger than they were before then. You think about tenements and then what they are today. What can we do policy wise to encourage that apartments be, as large as they were, or at least aspire to be as large as they were in the New Deal? When we see public housing being built with, that's like nice sized housing, maybe not quite suburban, but certainly larger than what we're seeing today. So Mason, I'll give you a chance to start there if you'd like to answer.
Yeah, it sounds good. Incidentally, this is one of the stories that got trotted out by opponents of rent control, was that it was leading to people staying in apartments that were larger than they needed after their kids had grown and left and stuff like that. One of many stories people told about rent control that were sort of highly exaggerated and based on a handful of anecdotal examples of celebrities on the Upper East Side and Upper West Side and stuff. But that's not the crux of the issue. So what is there? There's just two quick observations. One is that apartments are shrinking because the cost of construction is what it is. If we want, larger units, then subsidies would be necessary, right? This is something that, it's good for this conversation that people are actually starting. People like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are actually starting to talk about producing new public housing, right? That had been sort of off the table for so long, but we should think of this as social housing, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is this is a real issue for public policy because there is a trade-off involved, right? We need more units desperately. How much are we willing to trade off in terms of the size of the units in order to get that?
I can build on that real quick. We do have this simultaneous movement in both directions in New York City. We have a push for smaller and smaller apartments and changes to the Multiple Dwelling Act to allow that, micro units. Yep. And such. And we did get rid of a lot of our single room occupancy housing that was some of the lowest cost housing in the center of the city. At the same time, we have ultra luxury gigantic housing. The most recent building that was built on Billionaires Row in West 57th Street is one of the tallest, thinnest residential buildings in the world. And it has like 60 apartments, and 16 of them were in the building that was there before. So like the new tower only has 40 something. This is ridiculous. And we've seen examples of rent stabilized housing that's been taken down and replaced by housing that has the appearance of being more dense in that it's taller and has fewer units. So at the same time as we have this squeeze on multifamily housing, producing more with less, as in micro units, we have those who can afford it buying basically suburban homes stacked on top of each other on the skyline. So we kind of have to attack both things at the same time.
I agree with Sam. This is people issue, right? I had some criticisms of us as individuals, and I think this is one of those criticisms. We salivate for these big spaces, but what is our true need, right? I think that's a big question, and we need to answer that collectively. And I think we'll find, if we're honest with one another, we don't need all the space that we salivate for. I'll just leave it at that. And that goes for both sides. Whether you got the money to pay for a lot of space, do you really need it? What's it going to do, right? It's the argument we make when we say these empty buildings are just safety deposit boxes, right? Like, so, but that could be utilized for somebody who really is in need, right? So it's just us changing and really addressing our true need, not what we salivate for.
El, did you have anything you want to add to that? If not, we can move on. I think we have time for one more question.
Let's go for the last question.
Perfect. This question comes from Renette, responding to Sam, particularly what you were discussing with Red Vienna. Renette was wondering, what part of social housing do you think will work well here in the US? Like what aspect of it do you think is most likely to succeed? And I guess, Sam, since that was most directed at you, we can start with you.
Sure. And Renette was with me in this delegation. She's an organizer with Hope in East Brooklyn, and has been doing great work in eviction defense and other housing struggles. So, Renette, you saw it too. And I think we saw the potential. And part of what we have to do in coming back is to raise people's expectations that public housing, subsidized housing can be beautiful, it can be large scale, it can be accessible, it can be feminist and anti-racist and all the things we want it to be. In terms of what pieces can we do here, I think the other piece of it is showing that we have pieces of this already. We have public housing, we have subsidized housing, we have limited equity co-ops, we have rent control. We just don't have enough of any of it. And so getting those pieces together is key. And I hope doing some demonstration projects also that show people that this is not just possible, but desirable, will then lead to more and more and more from there. But we'll be working on that together.
Does anyone else have any thoughts on what we can learn from Red Vienna?
I just want to flag the importance of something Sam mentioned in his original comments. The fact that housing insecurity sits in the context of other forms of insecurity is really, really important to recognize. So he was talking about, for example, the ways in which a sort of healthy welfare state contributes to secure housing, right? We tend to forget that. We even have come up with, well, there's times in which this concept of affordable housing suggests that siphons off the rental question from the income question, right? Like sometimes we talk about, I think sometimes we're reluctant to talk frankly about poverty. And the fact that incomes are too low, as Rob was saying in his remarks, to support housing, and welfare housing vouchers are too low. This is a huge cause of the deterioration of the city's housing stock in the 1970s, was the fact that the state level housing voucher value got frozen in 1974, not to be raised again until the early 80s, by which time it's, a huge share of its value had been eroded by inflation. Like, imagine telling the story of the abandonment of the Bronx without that being part of it, And so, yes, I think that we need to have a holistic view of housing, housing as a human right that's bound up and, in fact, requires us to attend to other human rights.
Meeting people's basic needs, Mason. Sam and the folks who went to Vienna were not far from Nordic countries where they have basic income. Your family only pulls in $16,000 and our minimum standard is 22. Well, you get a $6,000 check. We can do it. We did it during the COVID, right? We sent out checks to everybody. Not everybody needed those checks. So we have the ability to do it. Do we have the political will to take care of people? Does government really want to take care of people the way it's supposed to? And I think that's a bigger question. This poverty thing sits right at the base of it, man. It's never been addressed in this country. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X took bullets fighting this issue.
I think your comments are really a good way to end our program. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you, Gail. I can't wait to read your book. I'm excited. I put in my order while we were while we were in this conference.
Well, I concur with Gail, Rob. Those were perfect comments to end on. I just wanted to say thank you so much to all of our panelists for this really fantastic discussion. I mean, this could have gone on easy another half hour. There's just so much you can discuss with the New Deal housing and its legacy today. And also thank you to all of you who were up at 9:30 during the week listening to talk about New Deal housing. We need more people to be involved and understand the importance of these issues. And then, of course, it wouldn't be a nonprofit program without a fundraising ask. So please, if you can, support the New Deal by going to livingnewdeal.org/donate. The link is in the chat. So thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and we hope you have a good night.
Thank you, Adam. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Adam.
Everybody.
Good night.